All right. Perfect. Yeah. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome today Dr. William O'Grady from the University of Hawaii at Manoa to talk about Jejueo, Korea's hidden language. I'm Dr. Rory Walsh. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Nam Center. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. O'Grady last year in Hawaii around the time of our AAS conference. And we had a fantastic time talking about Jejueo and the linguistic concepts and the political issues surrounding it, and I think we're in for a very interesting talk this afternoon. So I would like to tell you a little bit more about Dr. O'Grady. He's well known for his work on Korean and Jejueo, as well as his commitment to the study of syntax, language acquisition, language revitalization, and endangered languages. And you may, in fact, already know him from his many books. I've had this first one for years. His books include The Handbook of Korean Vocabulary with Miho Chu, The Sounds of Korean, again with Miho Chu, and Jejueo, The Language of Korean's Jeju Island with Chung Yong-yang and Sejong-yang. Then also How Children Learn Language and Syntactic Carpentry, very exciting stuff. And the co-editor with Brian McWhitney of the Handbook of Language Emergence and the co-author with John Archibald of a widely used textbook, Contemporary Linguistic Analysis, which is now in its 9th edition. So in addition to thanking the weather for not being super Michigan on us again today, I would like to thank Dr. O'Grady for being here, and I am very excited to hear what he has to say. Welcome. Thank you.
Center for Korean Studies for inviting me here. And I bring greetings from the sister institution, the Center for Korean Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Now, it was suggested that I speak for about 30 minutes so that we'd have lots of time for questions and discussion afterwards, and that's what I will do. However, it turns out, I believe, that perhaps 30 seconds may be enough for me to convince you of the central thesis of my talk, which is that Korean has a second indigenous language, namely Jejueo. And that, of course, is the variety of speech that you hear in somewhat diminished form these days in Jeju. So let me get this thing started here. I have a little conversation that I'd like you to listen to, if you don't mind. It just takes a few seconds. Here it goes.
돈배 어디 있수가?
살레부터 시죠?
칼은 살레 소고비 있수가?
아니요, 그디 어쩌 돈배 옆이 찾아보라.
What you just heard is a conversation in Jejueo. One of the speakers is an elderly man, and the other is a young boy who won a Jejueo speech contest not too long ago. Can I play it for you one more time? Oops.
돈배 어디 있수가?
살레부터 시죠?
칼은 살레 소고비 있수가?
아니요, 그디 어쩌 돈배 옆이 찾아보라.
Still couldn't understand it? Well, you're not alone. In fact, this has been going on for a very long time. In 1510, King Kim Jong, who was a geographer and author of the topography of Jeju Island, was overwhelmed by the number of unfamiliar words and expressions that he encountered there in Jeju. And he reported that he had to learn the language all over again, as if he was a child. In 1601, Kim Sang-un, a secret inspector for the national government and author of the travelogue Namsarok, complained that he had trouble understanding the speech of Jeju Islanders. He compared it to the sound of a bird. Then skip ahead a century, 1702, Lee Hyung-sang, author of the Encyclopedia of Jeju, requested an interpreter during his 15-month stay on the island. And this brings us to the big question. Is Jejueo a language, or is it just a dialect of Korean, as is commonly believed? So, language or dialect? Well, linguists distinguish dialects from language by investigating their degree of intelligibility. This is Charles Hockett, who was a very distinguished linguist in the last century. And in the 1950s, he put forward a proposal, which is now widely accepted, for a strategy, for a measure that allows us to distinguish between dialects and languages. And he suggested people who speak the same language can understand each other. Sort of makes sense, right? People who cannot understand each other must be speaking different languages. So let's take an example. The speech of Washington, D.C. and the speech of London are mutually intelligible. That means they're dialects of the same language, which is English. On the other hand, the speech of Paris and the speech of Rome are not mutually intelligible. What does that mean? Well, they're different languages. One is called French and the other is called Italian. Now, our question, of course, is this. Is Jejueo intelligible to people who speak only Korean? Well, to find that out, my colleagues and I conducted a comprehension experiment. It involved 56 participants. 23 of them were residents of Seoul, another 11 were residents of Jeju, and another 12 were residents of Busan. None of them had lived on Jeju or had any prior experience with Jejueo. Finally, we had 10 residents of Jeju Island who had grown up there and were familiar with Jejueo. And we had the participants listen to a Jejueo narrative that described a series of connected events. The recording was then broken down into 5 segments, which were played one at a time. And each segment was accompanied by comprehension questions in Korean. There were 9 questions in all. Would you like to listen to the first segment of the test? Okay.
멀지건이서 덕구는 소리 드럼신디 높도 안 빈 호나 사람이 나무 틀에 올라가네 벨 타는디 두어 개 낭알들에 털어줘 불고.
That one's easier than the first one you heard. The participants in the experiment got to hear it twice. Let me play it a second time for you, and then we'll do a little test, okay? Oops.
멀지건이서 덕구는 소리 드럼신디 높도 안 빈 호나 사람이 나무 틀에 올라가네 벨 타는디 두어 개 낭알들에 털어줘 불고.
Ready for your test? For this particular segment, there were 3 questions. They were all given in Korean, of course, and the respondents were able to respond in Korean rather than in Jejueo if they wanted to. So the first question was, what kind of noise was described at the beginning of the story? Anyone want to take a chance on this one? No. The answer was a rooster. Rooster. Oops, sorry. Second question was, how many people appear in the story? No? 2? No, 1. And then finally, oops, sorry. What is the man in the story doing? I beg your pardon? That's close. He was picking pears, which meant he was in the tree. Yeah, he was on a ladder in the tree. Yeah, not bad at all. How'd you guys do? Do you know who the last person was to take this test? It was the governor of Jeju Island, the former governor, Won Tojisanin. Yeah, Won Hee-kyung. He was the last person to take this test. I visited him in his office while he was still governor, and we gave him the test. Doesn't anyone want to know how he did? No, everything right, everything right. He was raised in a rural area in Jeju, and he understood everything. Yeah, yeah. But here's how most Koreans did. Well, the people from Jeju Island, of course, did very well. They got 90% correct. But the people from Seoul, from Yeosu, and from Busan, they had success rates of under 10%. How bad is the 10% success rate on Jejueo if you're Korean? Well, to try to get some idea of what it means to only get 10% correct, we did another experiment, and it involved Dutch and Norwegian. Dutch and Norwegian, of course, are the languages of the Netherlands and Norway, respectively. Everyone agrees that they're distinct languages, but they're related languages, so a lot of the words are similar. I put a few words from Dutch and Norwegian up there for you to look at. See the word for nose in Dutch and Norwegian, sort of similar, right, but different. Same thing for bread and book and so on. So that's what you get when two languages are related to each other, but also distinct. And what we did was we wanted to see whether the Dutch participants could understand Norwegian. So we had 28 speakers of Dutch, and we gave them a Norwegian version of the same narrative that you just heard for Jejueo. And our question was, could the Dutch participants respond correctly to the comprehension questions about the Norwegian narrative, just like our previous question had been, could the Korean speakers from the mainland respond correctly to the questions about the Jejueo narrative? Well, the results were surprisingly similar. The success rate for the Dutch speakers trying to answer questions in Norwegian was about 10%, and very, very similar to the results that we had for, say, Seoul. So what does that suggest with respect to the big question? What is the status of Jejueo? Is it a language or is it a dialect? Well, you know what the answer is, right? Based on linguistic criteria, Jejueo should be classified as a distinct language for exactly the same reason that Norwegian should be. The criterion of intelligibility is the decisive factor, the decisive measure that we use as linguists to distinguish between dialects of the same language and distinct languages. Remember, right, if you're speaking the same language, you should be able to understand each other. So this brings us to the next question, which is, how did Korea end up with two languages in the first place? Let me take you through a little bit of linguistics and a little bit of history. So I'm going to start by mentioning two basic facts about language that hold for every single language on Earth and for every single time period in history. The first fact is that language is constantly changing. You may not notice it changing, but during your lifetime, your language will change. New words will come in, new sayings, new patterns, and so forth. And when two groups who speak the same language initially are not in continuous close contact, their language is going to change in different ways, to the point where eventually, over a period of decades and centuries, they can no longer understand each other. Let me give you an example. This is really how English and German became distinct languages as they descended from West Germanic. What was West Germanic? It was a language spoken in Europe between the 5th and 7th century AD. And what happened is the group of people who spoke West Germanic went in different directions geographically. Some stayed in the area of modern-day Germany, and others moved to England. So what happened to West Germanic over that period of time when those two groups were separated from each other? I have some vocabulary items for you to consider. Let's take the word for apple. In West Germanic, it was something like appellas. Over time, it became Apfel in German, and it became apple in English. Or take the word for elbow. In West Germanic, it was something like Ellenbogen. Over time, it became Ellenbogen in German and elbow in English. Or take the word for drink, which in West Germanic was something like Drinkanen. In German, it became ultimately trinken, and in English, drink. So that's an example of how, right, a language can split off into two distinct languages over time when the groups are no longer in contact with each other. And as I mentioned, this is not some sort of exception. This is just what happened, what has happened throughout history. Let's look at another example. Take French and Spanish. They are members of the same language family called the Romance family. They both descended from Latin. And around the year 1000 AD, the different groups went off in different directions. Their languages were changing in different ways, and ultimately they became distinct languages. Here's how it happened for a few words. The word for hand, right, in Latin was manus. In Spanish, it ended up being mano. In French, main. You can see how they're related to each other, right, but they're distinct. Or take the word for two. Duo in Latin, dos in Spanish, deux in French. The word for star, stella in Latin, became estrella in Spanish, and étoile in French. And this is also how Korean and Jejueo became separate languages. In fact, the question here isn't how could Jeju, the province of Jeju, have developed its own language. The question is, how could Jeju not have developed its own language? Think about the facts. Jeju is located about 51 miles from the nearest point on the peninsula. A few hundred years ago, that could not have been an easy trip back and forth in the types of boats they had available to them. In fact, even today, with the modern ferries that you can take to get from, say, Busan to Jeju, tourists are warned, let me quote here, they're warned that the seas can get choppy and that there can be strong winds and heavy rains along the way. Well, you go back 500 years, 700 years, those strong winds and those choppy seas would have been a little bit more dangerous, right, than they are now. Second, Jeju was under Mongol control for more than 100 years, from 1270 to 1374. That's a long period of isolation when you're in contact with some language other than Standard Korean. Moreover, third fact about Korean history, travel to the mainland was banned entirely for 2 centuries, between 1629 and 1825. That's a long period of isolation. So once again, question is, how could Jeju not have developed its own language, given those conditions of isolation and, at times, laws that prevented travel to the mainland? So what was the most crucial period in history for the emergence of a second language, namely Jejueo? Well, we believe that it happened during the Middle Korean period. Let me give you a little bit of history of your language, of Korean. It's usually divided into 3 phases. The first phase is Old Korean, what you call Kodaeguga. That would be the first millennium, up to about the year 1000. Then Middle Korean takes over around the year 1000, takes us into 1600. That's what you often call the Jungseguga. And then finally, modern Korean period begins around 1600. So there's reason to believe that during the Middle Korean period, Korean and Jejueo went in different directions to the point where mutual intelligibility was lost. It might have even happened earlier, but we know from the observations of people like Kim Jong and Kim Sang-un and Lee Hyung-sang, we know that by the time you get into the 1500s and the 1600s, people are reporting, I can't understand what they're saying there in Jejueo. At that point, you've got a separate language, of course. So probably you want to know, I hope you want to know, what types of differences arose in Jejueo and Korean as they diverged from each other. What is it that made them ultimately so difficult for you to understand when you hear Jejueo? Well, one thing were differences in pronunciation. One systematic difference involved words that begin with a kiok. So in Korean, that's a ge sound, right? But in Jejueo, it became a je sound. So the word for path in Korean is gil. In Jejueo, it's jil. The word for oil in Korean is girum. Right? In Jejueo, it's jirum. The word for deep in Korean, gipta. In Jejueo, jipuda. Notice the kiok has become a chiyut. That's a systematic change that took place over time. Then there are lots of differences in vocabulary. In some cases, the vocabulary items of Jejueo and their counterparts in Korean are sort of phonetically similar. In other cases, they're completely different. Let me show you. So take the word for sea or ocean. In Korean, bada, and in Jejueo, badang. So those two words are pretty close, right? Pretty similar. The word for tree, a little bit different. Namu in Korean, nang in Jejueo. Word for father, aboji, Korean, and abang in Jejueo. But then things start to get more and more different. Like take the word for potato, gamja in Korean, jisul in Jejueo. Or the word for egg, geran in Korean, and doksegi in Jejueo. No resemblance whatsoever. Those words aren't even related. Or the word for rainbow, mujige, right? That's Korean, but in Jejueo it's sangoji. Those are big differences, right? And those are the differences you get when a single language breaks off into two separate languages, and to the point where ultimately comprehension is impossible. One of the really big differences, the ones that linguists love to discuss, involves the verb forms and the particular suffixes that you add to verbs in order to express things like tense, for example, or perhaps even politeness. Let me give you an example here. Let's imagine that you want to express an action that you're observing as it takes place. The verb form for that is often called the present progressive, a linguistic term. So compare Korean and Jejueo in that regard. The speaker wants to say something like he or she or you or they is eating a potato. In Korean, you'd say something like 감자 먹고 있어. Informal speech, right? 있어. In Jejueo, it would be 지술 먹음죠. And that that you see there with the silent shiot at the end is what expresses the idea of an ongoing action. And the jo is a marker of informal speech. You're talking to a friend rather than to your grandfather or your teacher. How about the past progressive, where you are describing an action that you observed taking place in the past? Well, in Korean, it would be something like 감자 먹고 있었어, right? In Jejueo, it's 지술 먹음선. Notice that this time that shiot in the pachim of is actually pronounced because the next syllable starts with a vowel, so it's 먹음선. Now the again indicates ongoing progressive action, and the un at the end, that's the past tense marker. If you want to find out more, let me recommend a book that I co-authored with two linguists on Jeju Island, Changyong Yang and Sejong Yang. And we have, 250, 280 pages of examples like this if you want to find out more about the differences between Jejueo and Korean. All right, let's return now to what's sort of the big question of this talk, which is the dispute over languagehood and whether Jejueo is a language or not. I'd like to think that at this point, given that you weren't able to understand what was said in Jejueo, and given that there are all these differences, it'd be real easy to acknowledge that it's a separate language. But people are having a lot of trouble doing that. When we first presented the results of the intelligibility test at a conference, a scholar from the Jeju Research Institute leapt up and said, after I suggested separate language, just like I did here today, she leapt up, impossible, she says, impossible. One nation, one language, end of story. Korean can't have a second language. A professor of linguistics and a leading specialist on Jejueo subsequently wrote a paper for a fairly major Korean journal in which he said, the idea that Jejueo is a language separate from Korean is so ridiculous that even a cow would laugh. That was not a compliment. The National Institute of Korean Language, known in Korean as the Gungnip Gugawan, responded in a negative fashion as well. A petition signed by 52 scholars requested official recognition as Jejueo as a language. And the response that we got from the National Institute of Korean Language was, Jejueo, like the mainland dialects, is simply subsidiary regional speech. So why these reactions? Well, as best I can tell, they have something to do with the relationship between nation and language in Korea. Ross King, who's a well-known Koreanist and linguist, wrote, the notions of single nation, which would be the Danil Minjok, and single language, Danil Ono, are central to modern Korean concepts of national identity. And Lee Shi-won wrote, the ideology of one nation, one race, and one language has gradually emerged over the course of Korean history. This is not just an attitude that you find in South Korea, it's also commonly held in North Korea. In fact, Kim Il-sung, the founder of the North Korean state, commented on this very point. He says, ethnicity is characterized by the commonality of blood and language. Korean ethnicity cannot exist without our language. And you know, if you think back to the criticism that we received from different scholars when we suggested that the empirical facts show that Jejueo is a distinct language, they reflect that same attitude. Remember the scholar at the Jeju Research Institute? She said, one nation, one language, end of story, right? She was assuming that there has to be a one-to-one correlation between nation and language. The professor of linguistics and leading specialist on Jejueo, who had the laughing cow, he said, it might have been okay to call Jejueo a language if Jeju Island had been an independent country and Jeju people had a different ethnicity. However, those two requirements are not met. In linguistics, we talk about that as being the attitude that in order to have a language, you also have to have an army and a navy, right? And Jeju doesn't have an army and a navy, so how could it possibly have a language? And even the National Institute of Korean Language took a very similar stand. They said, look, it's just too difficult from a political and traditional point of view for us to acknowledge that Jejueo is a language. Where did these ideas come from? They come from long ago and from a very different place. These ideas date back to the 1700s, and they come from Europe, not from Korea, not from Asia. So there are people like Johann Herder and Henri Grégoire and Johann Fichte who put forward these ideas and which were very influential at the time. So Herder says, whoever was raised in the same language belongs to the nation of that language. Notice the equation of nation and language. Fichte says, national identity depends on the purity of the nation's language. But linguistic nationalism is really, really problematic, especially these days when we know so much more about nations and languages. I mean, if you look at the United Nations, they've got 193 member nations. The Philippines alone has 180 distinct languages. There's not very many languages left over if you're only going to have a total of 193. In fact, we know from work by the Ethnologue, for instance, that there are over 7,000 living languages in the world. It's really hard to equate nation with language at that point. Now, I think there is a way to create a link of sorts, a good link, between nation and language in the case of Korea, if that's important to do so, and it could be. And that would be to proceed as follows. The linguistic foundation of Korean identity consists not of a single language, but of a unique Koreanic language family comprised of two members, Korean and Jejueo. It's the language family, the Korean language family, that defines the identity, the national identity of Korea, not just one language. So you see you have the Korean tiger and the Jejueo halabojji. problem right now in Korea is the imbalance between the two languages. And, Korean has about 80 million speakers. Jejueo, on the other hand, is critically endangered, one step away, really, from extinction. Put another way, Korean's second language is on the verge of disappearing forever. It's now spoken by only about 2% of the population of Jeju. The only fluent speakers are grandparents. There are no instructional programs suitable for learning the language. And what's especially striking is the decline of Jejueo happened in the course of a single lifetime. If you could go back in time to 1950, Jejueo would be the dominant language there in that province. You go there today, it's very hard to hear the language spoken at all. How could this have happened in the space of a single lifetime, that a language can all but disappear from the face of the earth? Well, this is a tragic story here of oppression and suppression. So think about the oppression part first, in particular Sasam. I think those of you who are from Korea know about Sasam, right? And the violent deaths of between 15,000 and 30,000 Jeju citizens during the military operation in 1948 and 49. At the time, there were about 300,000 people living in Jeju. Up to 10% of the population was killed, massacred. Another 30,000 fled to the Osaka area of Japan, where they still live. In fact, we're doing some study on the Jejueo speakers there now. And then at the same time, tens of thousands of Korean-speaking migrants from the mainland were encouraged to move to Jeju. And naturally, their presence had a huge impact on the use of Jejueo because they only spoke Korean. Then, on the suppression side, there are government policies and their consequences. So one of those government policies was the institution of Korean as the official language of instruction in schools throughout Korea, including in Jeju. That happened in 1955, and from that point on, for the next couple of decades, children were physically punished in school for using Jejueo. And there's nothing surprising here. The use of government mandates to prohibit the use of a particular language in the school system is all over the world. Like, there's hundreds of endangered languages right now, and part of my job is to study them. And almost every one of them finds itself in a situation where either there's no opportunity to use the endangered language in school, or you are forbidden to use the endangered language in school. And that idea of using the school system to suppress a language without having to kill too many people at the same time, that idea goes back at least to the 1700s and perhaps even further. Another important factor is the insistence on the part of the national government that Jejueo is an inferior dialect of Korean. And the impact of that strategy can't be underestimated either. The power of shame, especially among the younger generation, can be really devastating. As Brinziger and Yang report in their study, the downgrading of the Jeju language to a mere Korean dialect or regional variety proved to be a highly efficient strategy in further undermining the self-esteem of the speakers. It's a particularly gripping quote from an interview with a Jejueo speaker who says, even among ourselves, we Jejueo speakers, those who speak Jejueo are looked on as backward. Right? Their self-esteem is badly undermined by the fact that they speak what others have insisted is an inferior dialect of Korean. So a final word, if you permit, as the sun sets behind Mount Hala. I have a proposition that I'd like to leave with you, faculty, students, members of the Center for Korean Studies. The field of Korean studies has to do better than this. Surely, if you're involved in the study of Korean culture, study of Korean history, study of Korean society, study of Korean politics, it matters that there's a second indigenous language in Korea, that its presence has been hidden for decades, even centuries, that there have been constant, deliberate efforts to suppress it, and that Korea is about to lose half of its linguistic heritage. we are standing by as the subject matter of our discipline, Korean studies, disappears before our very eyes. We've got to stop doing this. I hope that there's something we can do about it. I always end these talks by saying, Jejueo, 살리게 말씀. Let's save Jejueo. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. O'Grady, for that amazing and inspiring talk. I would like to now open the floor up to questions, both from the audience in person and on Zoom. You can put your question in the Q&A, and it will be read out in the room. Yes, we'll get started.
Thank you for a wonderful and really inspirational talk. As a Koreanist, I was sitting here and thinking to myself, shame on me. I have a kind of a question, which is less political, about the expression of Sino-Korean versus purely vernacular Korean expressions. Is there a difference in the degree of Sino-Korean expressions
In Jeju.
relative to Korean?
Right. So a lot of those Sino-Korean expressions came into the language quite a long time ago, even during the Old Korean period. And there are lots of words in Jejueo that are still Sino-Korean in nature, like the word for student, 학생, is, as you know, Sino-Korean, and that's also, I believe, the word in Jejueo, and quite a few others like that. A lot of people expect that because Jeju was under the control of Mongol for 100 years, that there'd be a lot of Mongolian in there as well, but there's not. Mostly just words for horses and animals. About maybe 200 words or so worked their way into the vocabulary. A lot of people think that there would be a lot of Japanese words in because there was a lot of contact between Japan and Jeju. They're very close to each other geographically. But there too, you don't find a lot of words there either. Most of them are Koreanic words, and they're just not the same pronunciation or the same form or the same morphemes as you get in standard Korean. Yeah. I see there's a question over there in the corner.
Thank you for your talk, and I have two questions. So for linguistic nationalism, you trace back to European thinkers, and I'm wondering how you would evaluate the role of colonial history in Korea to in reinforcing the one nation, one language ideology. And my second question is, so I'm from Gimen near Busan, and one of the differences that you pointed out, the palatalization, I think it's common in Gyeongsang dialect as well. So I was wondering about what would affect the intelligibility the most. Maybe, I don't know, maybe vocabulary, because I heard that North Korean defectors, they found South Korean language really unintelligible, like because of foreign languages.
Exactly. Okay, so you've asked two really good questions there. Thank you. So let me take the second question first. The types of changes that take place in languages as they diverge from each other are often drawn from the same small set of operations. So the palatalization of a g in front of a high front vowel, if I can talk like a linguist, the gi becoming chi, that's very common in a lot of different languages and varieties of language. It happened in Jeju, it's true, and also in other parts of Korea as well. The Gyeongsang variety, which is probably just a dialect because it seems to be mutually intelligible with what people in Seoul use as their language. It evidently underwent a similar change, probably not at the same time, but maybe it was at the same time. But that's certainly to be expected. Now, you raised the interesting question about North Korea as well. And there is a variety of Korean spoken in the north called, in the Hamgyong area. And a number of linguists, including the late Sasha Voven, believe that it's different enough from Standard Korean to be unintelligible, or at least not very intelligible. It might possibly be a variety, a separate language as well. So there'd be 3 members of the Koreanic family. There'd be Jejueo, there'd be, Korean and Standard Korean, and there would be Hamgyong. On the other hand, I do know a linguist who was able to make contact with a lot of people from Hamgyong, and she said it was still pretty intelligible to her, so it may well have changed. Now, if you look at the diaries of Kim Jong-il, there's a story about him actually being in Hamgyong on his horse and coming across an elderly man who spoke to him in Hamgyong, and he couldn't understand Hamgyong, so he got off of his horse and explained to the man why he shouldn't speak that way, and that he should speak Standard Korean. And I'm betting thenceforth he probably did speak or try to speak a Standard Korean. But there's evidence that at one point, yeah, there was another variety of Korean there. As for the origin of these ideas, there's a very good essay on this that compares Japanese and Korean, and they both were influenced by Western ideas, and in particular by the idea that nationhood and languagehood are one and the same or closely linked. And both countries ended up trying to adopt single language policies and pretending that the other languages in their territory were just dialects. So Japan has been doing this with the Ryukyuan languages now for decades and decades. There's 6, maybe 8 languages in the Ryukyuan Islands which are not intelligible to speakers of Japanese, but which they insist on calling dialects. In fact, I want to read you a quote here that may shock and disturb you. But during the Japanese occupation of Japan, which ended around 1945, the last 10 or 15 years of that occupation involved Japan doing its very best to suppress the Korean language entirely. There's a very good book by Pulitzer Prize winner David Haberstam called The Coldest Winter. And here's what he says about the Japanese attempt to suppress the Korean language. He says, "What the Japanese wanted was nothing less than to obliterate Korean culture, starting with the language. The official language of Korea was proclaimed to be Japanese. In schools, lessons were taught in Japanese." What does it remind you of? Right? They insisted that Japanese had to be the language of schooling. The Japanese language textbook was called the Mother Tongue Reader. And then finally, the Korean language was to become a regional dialect, nothing more. 2 of the major strategies that are used to suppress a language, making it impossible to use it in the school system, right? And treating it as a dialect. Those 2 very strategies were once used against Korean. And now we see them being used by Koreans against Jejueo. I'm sorry to have to say that, but that seems to be the reality, right? And there's a very, I don't know if I'll get another chance to say this. Let me say it now. This is not a direct response to your question, but Korea has this wonderful language framework act that was passed in 2011, the Hangugo Kibonbap. And in this piece of legislation, they describe the importance of the Korean language to the Korean nation. The state and people shall recognize that the Korean language is our most valuable cultural heritage, contributing to establishing cultural identity. Well, that's totally true, of course. What's less well known is that in 2007, the provincial government of Jeju passed what's called the Jeju Language Preservation and Promotion Act. And one paragraph of it says, Jejueo is the language by which Jeju people express their cultural feelings and identity. So you ask, what do they want? They want exactly the same thing as the majority of the country is getting. They want a language through which they can express their cultural feelings and identity. And of course, the reason that Japan wanted to suppress that when they occupied Korea is they didn't want Koreans to have their own cultural feelings and identity. Thanks for your questions.
Okay, so we have a few questions online through Zoom. The first question is from Jeju, and her question starts, you mentioned at the beginning that Jejueo is diminishing, but also that the language is constantly changing, which I totally agree. But I also wonder, is that linguistic purism? Can language documentation catch up with the language change?
Yeah. Right, so that's a really important question, and it's an issue that is very commonly sort of raised, that what we're finding in Korea, and in Jeju in particular, is the gradual loss of a language, and languages are lost all the time, and isn't this just sort of a natural change? Is that a reasonable interpretation of the question, maybe? Yeah. So it is true that languages change all the time, and as a result of change, they eventually become something else. I mean, that's how we got English and German from West Germanic, and that's how we got French and Spanish from Latin. You know, Latin didn't die. People are always talking about it as a dead language. It didn't die. It just evolved over time into multiple other Romance languages. But here's the key point. What has happened in Jeju is, there's nothing natural about what happened there. A military operation kills and displaces a third of the population. A government mandate suppresses the right of children to be educated in their first language. Unjustified denigration of a language to the point where its speakers are ashamed to use it. None of those are natural changes. Right? Those are the types of factors that in a liberal democracy call for reparations. They call for an apology and reparations. What Jeju has gotten so far for Sasam is basically a museum, right? A Sasam museum, right? That pays tribute to the thousands of people who were, killed in the military operation there. But the culture was killed too, or at least seriously wounded. The language as well. What's called for here are reparations. And there are programs of language revitalization. It's a specialty of the department in which I work. There are lots and lots of things that could be done. And I'll tell you 3 things that could be done. First of all, you recognize that Jeju as a language. That would help. Recognize that it exists. Second, you'd recognize that it is critically endangered, right? That immediate action needs to be taken. And third, you spend some money, maybe even a lot of money, maybe like $25 million of money. It takes a lot of money to have a genuine revitalization program. The efforts that are currently underway in Jejueo under the auspices of the provincial government are completely inadequate. There is a plan to use or to teach some Jejueo in elementary school. Okay? A lot of the teachers don't speak Jejueo themselves because they're from the mainland. The amount of time that they currently are spending in some schools on teaching Jejueo are 10 hours a year. Not a week, not a month, a year. Now, I'm a linguist. I work in the area of language acquisition. No one learns a language in 10 hours a year. Right? There's a university in Jeju, a national university, Jeju National University. There are no courses offered in Jejueo, in Jeju National University. The Korean department does not consider Jejueo to be a language, so they're not going to sponsor courses on Jejueo. There is no department of Jejueo. Now you compare that to what's going on in Hawaii, the very critically endangered language in Hawaii too, spoken by maybe 0.1% of the population. In Jeju we have maybe 2%, right? But 1/10 of the population in Hawaii. Yet the universities in Hawaii all teach Hawaiian as a second language now. The schools all teach Hawaiian as a second language now. It's recognized as a separate language. And even though we have a long way to go in terms of making reparations for what happened to the Hawaiian language, there are serious efforts being undertaken. And those efforts are supported in general by the legislature and in general by the population. That would be a reasonable model for Jeju.
Thank you so much for that great answer. Our next question is from Da-Young Jung, who's in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at UCLA. She wanted to thank you so much for the enlightening presentation. And she has two questions. Her first question is a methodological question. Is there any reason why you chose Jejueo narrative in the experiment rather than daily conversation? Would their comprehension increase or decrease when the participants listen to a dialogue instead of a narrative? And her second question is, how does Jejueo speakers' inner language of Korean look like? Any unique lexical or phonetic features?
Yeah, okay. All those are great questions. With respect to the first question about dialogue versus narrative, we used a narrative to make it easier. If you want to know what it would be like listening to the dialogue, slide 3, remember? The one I opened the presentation with, that was a dialogue, two people having a conversation. That was not easier to understand, right? What was the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
The second part was, would their comprehension increase or decrease when the participants listen to a dialogue instead of...
Right. So I answered that one.
So the second question, how does Jejueo speakers' inner language of Korean look
sure,
like?
Right. So what's happening on Jeju is this. Because of the contact between Jejueo and Korean, and because Korean is much, much, much more influential, it is gradually eating up Jejueo. So there is this variety of Jejueo a lot of the young people have. They think they speak Jejueo, but they actually can't pass the test that I gave you here. But they think they speak Jejueo, and they insist they speak Jejueo. What they're actually doing is using mostly Korean words and mostly Korean suffixes with some exceptions. So one exception is this. The remember that that we had on Mogam Sun, that the past tense marker? That gets used in the variety of Korean spoken on Jeju. And there's also a present tense form that they use a lot, which is men. It's sort of the present tense version of And again, you hear that, and people say, oh, you're speaking Jejueo. Well, they have a little bit of Jejueo. When we took 3 people who said fluent in Jejueo, and we played them a video, and we asked, just describe what's going on here in Jejueo. And they did. And then we looked at it, and we underlined the words that were Korean, and we circled the words that were Jejueo, and it was 10% Jejueo. It was 90% Korean. And this is one of the ways languages die. And especially when the languages are related to each other. Don't forget, Korean and Jejueo are sister languages, right? They came from Middle Korean. They have the same word order, for example. And a lot of the words are similar, as they should be, just as they are in Norwegian and Dutch. And that makes it very easy for people to think they're speaking Jejueo when actually they're just speaking Korean. There is a sort of Korean variety of Jejueo now that's used a lot by the younger people, but it's not the actual real Jejueo that you'd hear from their grandparents, unfortunately. Yeah, but it's a start in terms of maybe trying to revitalize the language. But it's really at the present time a marker, an indicator, a symptom of rapid language decline that is not going to end well if it continues. Got a question over here? Right over there.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. I have 2 questions for today. The first one is that you mentioned just now about how the languages were becoming different because the transportation was not really an easy thing in the past. But now that it's becoming more convenient about like traveling between Jeju and the peninsula, do you think the languages are becoming more similar or like it's still evolving?
Sure.
Or like it remains as it is? And my second question is that what is the actual like political threat to the government actually recognizing Jejueo as a language? Is there an actual threat to it that they are scared about?
Exactly, yeah. Right, so languages are always changing, and when languages come into contact, the change is all the more rapid. Right now on Jeju Island, no one knows, I tried to find this out, but what percentage of the people living on Jeju Island are actually from Jeju for the last 3 or more generations, and what proportion are relatively recent arrivals. And definitely there's a very large portion of the population that doesn't even know how to use Jejueo or would not be able to understand it because they were raised on the mainland. Of course, a lot of people who are born and raised in Jeju, they go to the mainland for jobs, to attend university and so on. So there's a very, very high degree of contact, to the point where there's no one, we've searched for this, but no one we can find on Jeju Island who only speaks Jejueo. Everyone on Jeju Island speaks Korean as well. That would not have been true in 1950, apparently, but it's true now. So every single speaker of Jejueo is heavily influenced by Korean at this point. Yeah. So that's definitely problematic. As far as political threat, there's no political threat at all. And there's no reason why Korea shouldn't follow the model of the European Union, which is to identify, respect, support, and fund the minority languages in its territory. And, if you want to find out more, about what can be done, there is just Google European Union language policy, and you'll be taken to a website that describes roughly what we would need on a smaller scale in Jeju, which is, first of all, acknowledging that there's a language there, second, acknowledging that it's critically endangered, and third, making the investment that you need to protect that part of your cultural heritage. I don't know of any country in the world that invests more in its cultural heritage than Korea. And yet there's this one blind spot. And it's a really strange blind spot. A few years ago, there was a conference, and it was sponsored by the National Institute of Korean Language, who took it upon themselves to have an international conference on endangered languages. And I thought, wow, this is great. Got the published proceedings of the conference. Well, the endangered languages for which they were expressing concern and respect did not include any in Jeju, or any in Korea, in fact. The word Jeju was mentioned once in the entire conference proceedings, and it was mentioned as part of a reference to the possibility that there might be a second official language in Jeju soon. What was that second official language they were considering? English. English. The word Jejueo was never mentioned. The existence of Jejueo was never mentioned in an international conference held in Korea, sponsored by the National Institute of Korean Language, and devoted to the challenges of dealing with language endangerment. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your very insightful talk. And actually, your talk is a kind of awakening for me, because your lecture invited me to reinterpret all experience that I have with a friend from the Jeju Island. When I met a friend from the Busan and the other areas, actually I can distinguish where they're from their accent and everything. But people from Jeju Island, actually they speak just standard Seoul Korean language, so it's very hard to distinguish where they are from. Actually, it's related to their, let's say, the language status, that they have to, completely change their language from Jeju to Seoul standard language. My question is, did you find any Korean scholar who share same idea and same proposal that you have? When you have this kind of idea to Korean scholar, what is their general attitude and reaction? That's the first question. And second, the small question is there any international experience to revitalize endangered language into live language? For example, you can find many examples, not only in Korea, but in Europe and East Asia and elsewhere.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, with respect to the latter question, there are many language revitalization efforts, hundreds, in fact, going on in the world today. Some successful, some less successful. One of the reasons why the effort in Jeju right now, undertaken by the provincial government, is not going to be successful is that they don't have the right expertise to understand what it takes to revitalize a language and how much exposure a child would need to a language in order to acquire it and to maintain it. The idea of 10 hours a year, the usual figure would be 30% of your daily language exposure should be to that endangered language. So you literally need to hear hundreds of thousands of words a year in a language in order to be able to acquire it, and that's not going to be done as things now stand. And I can give you lots and lots of examples, and there are books actually filled with examples, and there's websites. Go to the Endangered Language Project at the website for my own department, and you'll see hundreds of websites there that describe ongoing efforts to revitalize languages. In the case of Korea, and Jeju in particular, as I wrote myself 10 years ago when I first started working in that area, there are many reasons to believe that it could be very successful there. One reason is that the two languages involved, Korean and Jejueo, are sister languages, and it's easier to acquire a sister language than a language that's completely unlike your own. So the challenge, say, in Hawaii, where you have people who are English speakers now trying to learn their traditional language, Hawaiian, very challenging, because Hawaiian and English are not related at all. Like, no words are similar, and the grammar is totally different. Whereas for Korean speakers trying to learn Jejueo, it'd be much easier. And I remember saying 10 years ago, one of the real advantages we have here is that Jeju National University is right there. And they have all the resources they need to do what we do in Hawaii, which is, first of all, we train people to teach Hawaiian as a second language. We let them major in Hawaiian so they can become fluent and then train them to teach it. I said, this is great. 10 years later, there's still not a single course on Jejueo being taught in Jeju National University. Another thing that I remember saying at the time is, look, Korea is not a poor country. I mean, they spent $500 million on culture last year. I said, there's money, we're going to be able to get funding for this. No, we're not. So these are all, really serious issues, serious challenges. I'm sorry, what was your first question? Do you remember? Oh, yeah, of course, yeah. Well, okay, look, first of all, it's never good for a foreigner to come and tell other people what they should be doing, and I'm not, really. I work with a group of people on Jeju Island who are from Jeju Island, who are native speakers of Jejueo. Two of them are linguists, and there's also the Jeju Apo, which is this Jeju Language Preservation Society. In the past, I've tried to work through them as well at their own invitation. So what I'm doing is just based on the expertise that I happen to have in certain fields of linguistics, making available information that they might find useful. They sent to me a young graduate student, Yang Sejong, who earned her PhD at the University of Hawaii and went back to Jeju with huge amounts of acquired knowledge about how to do language revitalization and so on. So we try to work with them. I was invited to give a talk to the Linguistic Society of Korea about Jejueo. And I flew over for one night to give the talk the next day and then flew back home. And they did nothing. They listened to me. They said, we're going to take care of this for you, William. Nothing. They don't want to, no group wants to stand up and say that there's a second language in Korea, right? Everyone is just committed to the myth. It's as if the physicists, it's as if the national government said, look, there's something really special about Korea, which is that light travels at a faster speed here than anywhere else in the world, right? And the physicists, instead of saying, that's ridiculous, they just keep quiet, don't say anything. So people go around believing, light travels faster here in Korea than anywhere else on Earth. Well, I'm sorry, but it's sort of like that with the linguistic community there too. They know, anyone who's trained as a linguist knows that Jejueo has all the properties of a distinct language. It's got different phonetic rules, it's got different vocabulary, it's got different grammatical patterns, it's not intelligible to people who didn't grow up in the community. Everyone knows. They know. They know that that means it's a distinct language, but they won't say it, right? And the National Institute of Korean Language, which has linguists, they won't say it either. They are insisting it's just another dialect, right? So that's where we are there. And one of the reasons I was happy to come over here and give this talk was I felt it's time to stop talking to the linguists and start talking to other people in the field of Korean studies, the people working on culture and society and politics, right, and history. There's dissertations to write. If anyone's in this room wants to write a dissertation or a master's thesis, believe me, there's things that need to be uncovered. There are things that need to be brought out, right, to public view and discussed. And it occurred to me that in a way, in some ways, scholars working in the field of Korean studies may be better equipped than even linguists to stand up and say, something's wrong here, right? We've been hiding something. As a nation, we have to sort of look at what's been going on in Jeju, right? And start thinking about what we should do to make reparations for what has happened to this point.
Hi, thank you for the nice talk. I had a couple of questions. First one is if Jejueo, if you ever see it like written anywhere.
Yeah, sure.
And then, if it's ever used in writing, even if it's symbolic. And then the second one too is, with the big tourism industry in Jeju, do you think that there could be some kind of opportunity through that to get like funds or raise awareness or something like that?
Sure, yeah, right. So Jejueo was not a written language over the years, over the centuries, it was not. Occasionally people would write things in Jejueo, and when they did it, they would use sort of a phonetic script, quite a little bit different from Hangul. But now they have developed an orthography, and it is Hangul. There's some debate over the orthography and how it should work. And I've sort of been involved in the periphery of that debate. I think they've made some bad decisions. One of them has to, there's no blackboard here, so I can't write, but one of them has to do with that the that indicates ongoing action. They don't know what to do with the shiot at the end of the because that pachim, miyum shiot, that pachim, it doesn't exist in Korean. And because they believe Jejueo is Korean, they don't know what to do with the So what they're doing with it is they're taking the shiot and they're putting it into the following syllable. That's the equivalent of taking a word like kap, which means price, you know how that's written with the pyup, shiot, and spelling it, putting the shiot into the next syllable. So when you write kapshi, right, you'd write it as kap plus shi. That's sort of the position that they've taken. But it would be much better, as we've shown in an article that we've written about this, it would be much better to maintain the Hangul tradition of keeping together suffixes. So, if is a suffix, the whole suffix should be written in a single umjal. Whether or not we can convince people to do that or not, it's difficult when they keep insisting this is really just Korean. And Korean doesn't have that pachim, so how could Jejueo have that pachim? That's really sort of frustrating. The second one was about the tourism question. Oh, the tourism, yeah. Okay, so there was a lot of discussion a few years ago of building a Jeju village where people could come and see Jeju people creating the type of foods that are distinctive for that area, maybe using Jejueo among themselves, and so on. To my knowledge, that has yet to be built. However, there was an experimental project last summer involving Yang Sejong, my former student, in which at one of the major tourism sites, they set up these little mini classes for people who wanted to find out more about Jejueo. And, there was certainly some interest. I don't believe that is going to be sufficient to flip the coin, right, to get what's needed. But education is an important part of this. I created a document with my colleagues on things everyone should know about Jejueo. And the idea was that it would be used in university classes. Right? So we talked about all the things I've talked about here today, where Jejueo came from, why a separate language developed on the island, what the major differences were, how critically endangered it was, what needed to be done in order to save it, why it should be saved, and so on. And I distributed it to as many people as I could in Korea, faculty members who teach language courses and so on. There wasn't that much interest. Okay. So it's a little bit frustrating, but when you look at successful language revitalization programs around the world, none of them were easy at the beginning. You have to try to keep making the case to different groups of people. It's easier actually to make the case to young people. Like the last time I spoke about this in Korea, the young people were, we didn't know that. And the old people were, it can't be true. It's not true. It's a dialect, Thank you.
Thank you again so much. You've given us all so much to think about and to talk about. And I'm looking forward to having further conversations with you. Before we go, I would like to invite everyone here to our final colloquium series lecture of the semester on April 5th with Dr. Hee-Kyung Cho, Associate Professor at the University of Washington, who will be discussing web graphic narrative and platform culture. And for now, let's give one final round of applause to Dr. O'Grady. Thank you so much.